For caregivers, very often people start with 9-minute notice. A parent falls, has a medical emergency, boom, you're a caregiver.
911, what's your emergency?
America's healthcare system is broken and people are dying.
Welcome to Code WACK, where we shine a light on America's callous healthcare system, how it hurts us, and what we can do about it. I'm your host, Brenda Gazar. This time on Code WACK, what happens when caregiving calls on you with only minutes or days' notice? And what does it really cost, emotionally, physically, and financially, to care for someone you love? To find out, we recently spoke with Mary-Elizabeth Harmon, a scientist turned storyteller and caregiver whose life changed in an instant. What she thought would be a brief visit to her father ultimately became a years-long caregiving journey that nearly pushed her to the brink and ultimately inspired her vision for vertical villages, where neighbors foster caring communities and economies to support one another through life's toughest moments. As the founder of Village Company 360 and the caregiver of her mother in Virginia, Mary-Elizabeth reveals just how unprepared our systems are for the caregiving crisis and why all of us need to pay attention. This is the first episode in a two-part series with Mary-Elizabeth. Welcome to Code WACK, Mary-Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Happy to have you. To start, can you tell us a bit about yourself? Who are you? What do you do? And how did you get where you are today?
All right. So my name is Mary-Elizabeth, and I describe myself as a scientist turned storyteller, caregiver, and village catalyst. So I know that's a lot. So the scientist part is that I'm a former research biologist, but it wasn't a good fit. And so I went on this long journey to try to find something that fit better. And in the process, I became an analyst for the federal government, but then eventually resigned. And then during that time when I had resigned from the government, my father had been placed on hospice. So I left Atlanta, where I was living, and I went to Chicago to go spend some time with him before he died. And in that process, I became his full-time caregiver. So my father was fully bedbound and he had dementia. So he required 24/7 care, and that wasn't anything that my family could financially afford. And so he and my mom had been living in a senior community in Chicago, and my niece had been in the home with them, supporting them. And she was just getting overextended. So when I went up to go say bye to my father, I became his full-time caregiver. And like I said, he had been put on hospice, so the expectation was that he would, die within the next 6-7 months or something like that. And that did not happen. In fact, he lived another 2.5 years. And in that process, we decided to leave the senior community and moved to a standard apartment building where I took care of him. And during that process, I became so exhausted that I fantasized about jumping off the balcony. And I thought, this is crazy. I'm in an 8-story building full of people. Surely there is somebody in this building who would help me if they knew what was going on, in the same way that I would help someone if they knew what was going on. And I said, we need villages in buildings, vertical villages. And so I got the idea of working to foster caring communities for and by neighbors, particularly in apartment buildings. And so a village, so that's how I call myself a village catalyst. And that has led me to start a business called Village Company 360, and that's what I'm working to develop today.
Amazing story. I'm so sorry that you felt so in despair that you considered jumping off, the 8th-story floor, I think it was.
Yeah, our balcony in the 8-story building. And, and it wasn't that I felt I was going to harm myself, but the thought crossed my mind, not that I would do it, but I was so exhausted. And that's a reality for a lot of caregivers. And I, as a caregiver, actually had more support than many people in that I did have family in the area, so I could call on them for assistance with things like cooking and, to come and take my mom out, because when we lived in Chicago, I did have a sister who lived there, but she worked full time, so she couldn't be in the home during the day. So my mother was essentially bound to the home as well. Whereas when we moved to Alexandria, I had a sister and a niece who could come, take my mom out, make sure that her needs were being met. So I had that support. I also had the support in that I never had to worry about rent or food, which is not a reality for a lot of other caregivers. So in that respect, though my caregiving experience was very difficult, I'm still in it. It's not as difficult now taking care of my mom physically, but it's a hard road for a lot of people. And, 70% of caregivers have been shown to have depression. It's hard on health. Caregiving spouses die at a 63% increase from non-caregiving spouses.
Yes. elderly spousal caregivers who reported caregiving strain had a 63% higher mortality risk compared with their non-caregiving peers, according to a 1999 study.
So it's very hard on people's health. That's why I'm working to have neighbors help neighbors, because I just think with the care demands that we have in this country, with our shifting demographic, we need to start looking towards each other. And neighbors, by virtue of their proximity, make very good candidates for that. And the demand is just so large that we just cannot rely on professional care systems for that to happen.
I haven't yet been a caregiver, but someday I might be. And I think many people become caregivers. I think most people will become caregivers in their life at some point. And so this affects all of us.
It does affect all of us. And in fact, I read a comment of someone on LinkedIn, and there was a gentleman who apparently said, like, we don't have a caregiving problem. And she was just so offended by that. And I can understand why she was offended. And I said, well, I'm not going to get offended, but what I am going to take that comment to mean is that I need to do a better job at explaining why there is a caregiving problem. And so I wrote a document on my website that I kind of fashioned after Roosevelt's 4 freedoms to share 4 care facts. And the first fact is we will all need care or give care eventually. That is a fact, right? And so the sooner that we start to get in the mindset that this is something that it's going to face us all. So the more proactive we are in getting involved with our neighbors and or just other family members and just thinking about, well, what will happen if? So, again, when somebody's expecting a baby, they have 9 months, they prepare, they, maybe paint a room and things like that. But for caregivers, very often people start with 9-minute notice. A parent falls, has a medical emergency, boom, you're a caregiver. So it can happen within minutes that people become caregivers. And so I'm just proposing that we start to have some of those neighborly caring support of the people who are immediate vicinity, because again, if you have an emergency and you have to run away, and the neighbors are just, like I said, neighbors are potentially first responders. And so that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Right. That makes perfect sense. They're the people that can get to you the quickest, the easiest. Mm-hmm. And are there like 24/7, even though they may not be in your house, they're in your vicinity usually.
That's exactly right. I had a neighbor, he's since moved, but he had kidney disease and he lived 1 floor up from me. And although he has family in the same city, I could get to him within a minute. I mean, literally, I could run upstairs in a minute if anything ever happened. And so he had a lockbox on his door. I knew the combination, so that if ever I needed to let myself into his home, that I could do that. And so again, those are the kinds of things I want us all to be thinking about, because today it may be somebody else having an emergency, but if you have a parent who lives alone or if you yourself live alone, these are things that we should be thinking about.
Today, you're an unreimbursed caregiver for your mom. Why is that the case? Is it, for example, because of the state where you live? And you're in Virginia now, is that right?
I am in Virginia. Yes. Okay, so I use the term unreimbursed, and actually I would like to give credit to Denise Brown of your Caregiving Years Academy for that. I previously called myself an unpaid caregiver, and Denise pointed out that we as caregivers, well, first of all, now it's estimated that our caregivers are providing over $800 billion of labor a year, right? So if caregiving were a business, it would be the world's largest revenue generating company, right? And so to just say that, oh, we're unpaid, wait a second, we are providing the largest revenue generating, activity in the world of a business. And so we are not being compensated or reimbursed in the same way as a healthcare system would be reimbursed if a nurse or a doctor were doing that work. So I choose that word very intentionally. So that's one thing. But then to get more to your question about my state. So in different states and in different circumstances, caregivers actually can get paid. So I would like to very much communicate that. So there are opportunities depending upon where you live. Now, as I said, my father had been living in Chicago when I became his caregiver. And at that time, I was actually able to get paid for a couple of months. So what happened was the city of Chicago had resources. So actually, I started my caregiving journey as a virtual caregiver in that I organized resources for my parents while I was living in Atlanta, in another city. And so I got in touch with the Agency on Aging in Chicago and found out that my parents were eligible for 20 hours a week of homemaker care. So it wasn't anything medical, but to have somebody come and help, do the laundry, help with food preparation, and also actually help my father eat and drink because he couldn't do those activities on his own. So they were eligible for that, both of my parents together, 20 hours. So when I went to Chicago, there was a woman there who did that, but then her agency decided to stop serving my parents' neighborhood. So the agency called me and said, well, you're going to have to find another company to come and do the work. And I said, well, actually, I'm doing the work. So is there some way that I can get paid for it? And they said, well, yeah, if you can find an in-home care company that hires family members, you can. And so that's how I was able to do it. So I went and I got hired by a home health agency. And so, it was very easy for me to pass the exams and everything because I was already doing the work. And my parents were my only clients. And so that's how I was able to get paid for 20 hours of caregiving a week. But when we moved to Alexandria, Virginia, the city just didn't have the same level of resources as Chicago. So I wasn't able to replicate that. Yes. So, but I do, people should very much look into resources for caregivers because they do exist. They are scant, I will say. So there's not an abundance, but it's not an impossibility to get paid. But at this current moment, I am not. However, there is one other thing I'd like to add, and that is that I had been also paid by the Department of Veterans Affairs. So my father was in the Navy, and the VA, I have the most glowing, wonderful things to say about VA. And I know that that's not a message that people often hear, but I'm so appreciative and so grateful to the Department of Veterans Affairs. They did really right by my father and my family. I was able to get some financial benefit for him to help pay for medical bills and for medical, just medical related issues. And then after my father died, I was able to get a survivor's benefit for my mother. And that helped to pay for me. So I was able to get paid that way. But then I later got my mom into a program called Program for All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly. So I had to stop the VA benefits at that point.
Okay. So what kind of toll has caregiving and caregiving without reimbursement taken on you personally?
Yeah, so it's been difficult. So what I will say, though, is that when I chose to become my father's caregiver, again, I will be honest, I was thinking I was looking at an 8-month journey, and 8 years later, I'm still a caregiver. So it did not turn out the way that I expected. But what I will say is that when I made that choice, I decided to approach it as a spiritual practice and then also as a way to document what I was learning to share with other people. And so from the beginning, I saw it as an opportunity to say, okay, this is something a lot of people are going through. How can I use this experience to support other people? So because I went into it with that mindset, and I went into it with the mindset of building something from day one, it took some of the sting away from it for me, I guess, or I could see that there was a purpose in it, or something greater than just me taking care of my father, which, that in and of itself is huge. But, to understand that anything I was learning could serve, as many families as I could reach with my message, then, okay, so it makes it a little bit easier to bear the burden. Now, that said, I will say that, like I said earlier, I did face a level of exhaustion that I really, like I said, I wasn't really going to hurt myself, but it's like you get to the point where you just think this cannot, I just can't continue. So exhausted that I would have to sometimes close down one sense to work. So for example, I would be so exhausted that I would have to close my eyes just so I could hear. Or I would have to close my eyes so I could speak because I couldn't look at somebody and speak at the same time. It was too much load on my nervous system. So I did become that tired. And then financially, I do want to make clear, as I pointed out earlier, I was in between jobs. And so I don't want to give the impression that I left a job to become a caregiver. However, when I was working, I was earning close to $100,000. So that's where, I had that potential to earn that much money. So being out of the workforce for 8 years, if we just look at my last salary, then you can say, oh, well, just in terms of salary, she's lost about $800,000. And then if you look at, the 401k matches and things like that, I'm looking at well over $1 million that I have not been able to reap because of my caregiving caregiving experience. So there's that. In terms of my health, so again, a lot of caregivers take a very heavy beating, or their health takes a very heavy beating. And I will say that that did not happen to me. In fact, getting back to Chicago, when I went there, I was uninsured and I was struggling with uterine fibroids. So I had uterine fibroids for many, many years, but I was either uninsured or I couldn't afford to take the time off to recover from a surgery. And so when I went to Chicago, because I wasn't earning any money, I was able to get on Medicaid. And because of that, I was able to get a hysterectomy. So by virtue of my being a caregiver, I was actually able to access medical care that I could not have accessed otherwise. So that was, a happy benefit of caregiving.
Wow, that's so interesting. And again, the reason you couldn't access it before was you couldn't take the time off work. Is that the main reason? So
yes, part of it, I couldn't take the time off work, but then at another point, I just did not have insurance. So this is when I was still living in Atlanta. And so, at that time, and maybe now I haven't lived in Atlanta, so I don't really know what's happening in terms of people being able to, we know that if anything, the situation's worse, but as a non-pregnant woman, it was virtually impossible for somebody to get on Medicaid. So I could not get on Medicaid even though I had no income. Georgia was one of those states that hadn't expanded Medicaid, so I was uninsured. And then when I finally was able to get some insurance through ACA, that in and of itself kind of took a little wrangling, because when I first applied, I was denied. And so they said, well, you have to apply for your state's Medicaid. But I couldn't get the Medicaid. And so it's like, okay, so I couldn't get it through ACA. I couldn't get it through the state. But then the next time I applied, the next year, I actually was able to speak to somebody. And so she said, well, this is how I would answer the question. So, we didn't break any rules, but she helped to get me onto ACA. And so then I was able to get insurance that way, but I didn't have a lot of confidence in what my out-of-pocket payments would be. So I was scared to use it. So luckily I was and still am in a health state that I just need a yearly doctor's checkups, just kind of screenings and things like that. So I went to a women's health clinic in my neighborhood that was flat fee. So I preferred to pay that flat fee because I knew exactly what I was facing. Even though my insurance potentially would have covered it, I just didn't know, am I going to have some surprise bill, just because I didn't quite understand what I was getting. So that was when I had some plan through the Affordable Care Act, yes. And that's when I was in Atlanta. I didn't get the Medicaid until I moved to Illinois, and actually here in Virginia, I also have Medicaid. So in those two states, as a caregiver, I was able to get that support.
Thank you, Mary-Elizabeth Harmon, founder of Village Company 360. Stay tuned for next time when we dive deeper into the community building she's doing to fill gaps in our care systems. Do you love Code WACK? Keep us on the air with a tax-deductible donation at heal-ca.org/donate. Do you have a personal story you'd like to share about our WACK healthcare system? Contact us through our website at heal-ca.org. And don't forget to subscribe to Code WACK wherever you find your podcasts. Code WACK's powered by Heal California, uplifting the voices of those fighting for healthcare reform around the country. I'm Brenda Gazar.